Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets. Chapter 3, Our Tripartite Communities Today. Rain beats at the window, while from the other side precise daylight, gray under a comprehensive cloud, but brighter than I would have expected for such a gray day, filters through. Keith Waldrop from The Not Forever. For gay men alive in America today, three pivotally defining years are 1969, 1981, and 1996, even if some of us are too young to know it. In 1969, the Stonewall riots opened the possibility of a new future for gay people by confronting stigma, demanding freedom for gay lives, and insisting on, if not acceptance, at least recognition that gay people were going to live their lives openly. We would have a mere 12 years living out this new future until 1981, when HIV first hinted at its presence. The dream of Stonewall would quickly be eclipsed by an unexpected nightmare that hurtled through gay communities, leaving in its wake devastating death, desolation, fear, and shame, as well as a legacy of incredible courage and heroic action in confrontation of a society that was largely ignoring our plight. In 1996, new and substantially effective HIV medication regimens, highly active antiretroviral therapy, widely known as HAART, would finally become available, and they would allow gay communities to slowly return to something resembling everyday, non-combat lives. Now, half a century after Stonewall and almost a quarter of a century after HAART became available, our communities are no longer united by a radical, in-your-face liberation movement or a struggle for biological survival. Without liberation or plague to unite us, today's gay communities, still living in highly stigmatizing American society, are surprisingly divided on what it means to be gay and live a gay life. Some push to return to liberation, insisting on distinctively gay lives. Others push for the acceptance of gay lives through social assimilation. Some experience these differences of purpose as problematically divisive, others as an expression of welcome diversity. However the differences are understood, this new post-epidemic era has offered us the possibility of finding and living lives as ourselves, both as individuals and as communities that do, after all, have some common interests. Out of incoherence came a universe, but a complex one. The early and late epidemics have been hugely influential in all American gay lives, and the totality of the two epidemics has created a psychologically complex community of men. Men have different historical relationships to the two epidemics, and their emotional and social lives reflect those differences. The demarcation of these groups is largely defined by age and by one's relationship to gay communities at the time of each of three events. The first occurred in 1981, when we became cognizant of an epidemic in progress. The second in 1985, when we were first able to test for HIV, and each man could know with some certainty if he was positive or negative. The third in 1996, the year of the introduction of HAART and the possibility that HIV-positive men might survive. For individual men, rather than the whole communities, another obviously pivotal event is the discovery that one has contracted HIV. In this ongoing event in the United States, approximately 26,000 more gay men contract HIV every year. Three groups of men defined. We live today in tripartite communities with significant psychological and social differences that define each group. The first of these, I will call them older group men, includes those who were out and active in gay communities before the introduction of HAART in 1996. Older group men experienced the early epidemic firsthand and were directly exposed to levels of death, loss, and trauma not usually experienced by younger men. Older group men are divided between those who personally experienced the early epidemic before 1985, when we were first able to test for HIV, and those who entered gay communities later. Those who were active in gay communities between 1981 and 1985 were exposed to significant additional trauma simply for living with 4 years of uncertainty about their own HIV status. They lived in fear of the onset of clinical symptoms that were commonly fatal within days. Men who became active in gay communities after 1985 largely avoided this trauma. The second group, middle group men, is populated by those who were out and active in gay communities after 1996. While they had no direct personal contact with the early epidemic, they were old enough to have absorbed secondhand the frightening association between gay men, AIDS, and the horrible, disfiguring deaths. As young children and adolescents, they learned that association from widespread public media, parents, and teachers. They were thus primed from childhood with significant anxiety about being gay and having gay sex. This early exposure was a significant developmental force for middle group men, and today they often feel psychologically like survivors of childhood and adolescent trauma. The third group, younger group men, includes those who were too young to have had exposure to the early epidemic or, during childhood, to the association between gay men and AIDS in the pre-heart era. Today's young men have never known HIV as almost inevitably fatal, and never experienced the trauma and loss that older and some middle group men could not escape. This younger group, born into a less ominous prognosis for sexually transmitted infections, has some social, sexual, and psychological commonality with gay men living in the pre-epidemic, gay liberation years between 1969 and 1981. Like members of those early communities, young men today exercise a great deal of sexual freedom, but within a milieu that is significantly defined by new technology, not all of which is for the better. And lest we forget, like those of the liberation era, a majority of young men today are still raised in rejecting or overly stigmatizing families and communities. The consequences are often profound. Who falls into which of the three groups is not hard and fast and varies with the specifics of any individual's social and psychological development. The developmental makers include at what age a child first had a sense of being gay or different in a way he associated with a gay identity. At what age a man was first sexually active, at what age he first came out as gay and became socially connected to other gay men, and at what age a child was first cognizant of media coverage of the pre-heart epidemic. Although individuals vary widely on all of these specifics, I have made some incredible, if debatable, assumptions about social, psychological, and sexual development to approximate the age ranges of our three groups. Based on these assumptions, older group men were born in 1971 or earlier, middle group men were born between 1972 and 1988, younger group men were born in 1988 or later. These age designations are approximations, with overlap at the margins between groups. Despite the divisions that my tripartite model delineates, our three groups of men share a great deal, both socially and psychologically. One common shared experience is shame about the early and late epidemics, which is largely rooted in shame about sex. It is not often explicitly stated, but the HIV epidemic among gay men has been almost completely vectored by the practice of receptive anal intercourse, RAI in the language of public health and epidemiology. Gay men have known this anecdotally since the early years of the epidemic, and methodically collected epidemiological data indisputably supports the idea. While not universally practiced by gay men, RAI is the most distinctive, non-heterosexual, sexual behavior that gay men engage in, and the behavior that heterosexual men most fear and stigmatize. For many gay men, RAI is also the most intimate form of sexual communication and, for many of them, has the same importance that vaginal sex has for heterosexuals. Because of the stigma directed at RAI, it is also the sexual act that gay men experience the most shame about and most shame each other about. RAI is by no means the only source of shame and shaming within gay communities. For gay men who are also members of ethnic or racial minorities, shame and shaming are often even more complicated, entrenched, and destructive. As illustrated later in this chapter, many younger group men hold essentially racist feelings about HIV, treating infection as something that happens only to certain kinds of people. Partly because of the association with RAI, many HIV-positive men in all three groups feel shame about having HIV, and negative men do often shame those who have it. Many gay men in all three groups, both positive and negative, experience shame about the very fact of a HIV epidemic, as if it confirmed the justice in broadly stigmatizing gay lives, and attempt to shame those who would call attention to it. Minority groups of all kinds internalize societal shaming, feel shame about themselves and about others like them, and respond with intra-group shaming. This destructive chain is characteristic of stigmatized minorities, and I routinely see evidence of it in my work with gay men. Call me old-fashioned or whatever you like, an older gay man once said to me, but I find effeminate men pretty much repulsive. A 27-year-old recently told me, whenever I come across an HIV-positive guy on Grindr, a smartphone hookup app, I just block him. Both men experience broad societal prejudice about these characteristics in others, disavowed the characteristics in themselves, and were repulsed by other gay men who had them. They protected themselves by projecting what they feared for themselves onto others. In 1985, when laboratory tests were first available and every man could determine his HIV status, positive and negative gay men were born. HIV status importantly bifurcates each of the three primary groups of older, middle, and younger men. Positive men, who often have their own source of shame about HIV, find the problem exacerbated when negative men treat them with active, sometimes overly hostile, avoidance and rejection. As a result of both the internal and external stigma, positive men too easily experience themselves as damaged or contaminated undesirables within their own communities. In turn, positive men sometimes express contempt for negative men, not only for the prejudice with which negative men treat positive men, a not unfounded reaction, but because negative men live in constraining fear and remain negative through the inhibition of emotionally expressive, sexual gay lives. While many positive and negative gay men are versatile, both tops and bottoms, the positive-negative tension can sometimes feel like a correlate to the sometimes polarizing conflict between bottoms and tops. The older group, the story of Luis. Born in 1971 or before, older group men share three determining life experiences. They are, by my definition, the only men of the three groups who had direct exposure to the pre-heart epidemic. Most grew up in a more problematic social environment than many younger and middle group men. And in 2018, older group men in their middle 40s or older are often experienced in gay communities as old. These three issues, loss and trauma and the epidemic problematic early developmental experience and aging, conspire to isolate older group men in contemporary gay communities. Trauma typically leaves survivors isolated, and this has clearly been true in the aftermath of the early epidemic. In the American society that these older survivors grew up in, gay teenagers more often lived ostracized, secretive, isolated lives than teenagers do today, and these older men experienced themselves as outsiders by nature. The fortunate ones finally found the gay community, and in those days it was often a community with coherence and purpose, driven first by a pre-Stonewall, homophile counterculture, then by Stonewall liberation, and later by the compelling emergency of the early epidemic. Today, gay communities have little such coherence. Unfortunately, older communities lost many to AIDS, along with much of the potential social support for survivors. Despite the perception of many younger men, older men continue to have sexual lives and, thus, concerns about HIV. Adults 50 and older account for approximately 10% of new infections in the United States. Even with a huge number of deaths before 1996, people 55 and over still account for 90% of long-standing infections. Older men are also more likely than younger men to receive an HIV diagnosis later in the course of illness. In 2010, 53% of HIV-related deaths were in people aged 50 or older. A later diagnosis and the consequent delay in initiating treatment have medical consequences with poorer prognosis, and symptoms of HIV and HIV treatment itself interact with many medical problems that older people experience. One of the reasons for the apparent inattention to HIV in older men lies in the mistaking of HIV-related symptomatology for other effects of aging. Older men may also have greater reluctance to discuss their sexual lives with their physicians, and their physicians, who are often younger than patients in this age group, are often reluctant to ask or simply assume that older men are sexually inactive. In addition to inadequate health care, the inattention to the sexual lives of older people has another consequence. A 1994 study from the University of California, San Francisco, which may still have relevance, suggested that people over the age of 50 who had a known risk for HIV were 1/6 as likely as those in their 20s to use condoms and 1/5 as likely to be tested. Older people themselves often do not think of themselves as sexually active and thus part of a risk group, and one could easily imagine their primary care physicians holding similar assumptions. The secrecy around older men's sexual lives is troubling. There exists a widespread feeling that there is something unseemly about older people having sex, despite many older people being sexually more skilled, more sensitive, and more connected than inexperienced younger people. Perhaps some of the feelings of unseemliness is rooted in the childhood and adolescent's inability to imagine parents having sex because the child or adolescent is, himself, so uncomfortable with the subject and so narrowly conceives of his parents. It would be likely discovering that God and the President both masturbate, or perhaps it is, the more realistic, deterioration of the older body. Regardless of the source, many of us live with the unproductive notion that sex among older people is not important or is non-existent, and if it does exist, it should at least be invisible. In fact, sex is an important form of communication and a source of pleasure and vitality for people of all ages. Older people must not allow others to relegate them to asexuality, social invisibility, constricted lives, and isolation. Older people must be active and not wait for or seek the recognition, acceptance, and approval of younger people. Luis is a 58-year-old Latino American who describes a great deal about older group gay men today. Luis and I first started meeting for therapy in 2013. He had discovered that he was HIV positive in 1988, at age 28, living in San Francisco. At the time, he was a law student at the University of California, Berkeley, but despite the diagnosis, he decided to finish school and attempt a career as an immigration attorney, working largely with Mexican clients living in the United States. His father had immigrated to the United States from Mexico in the early 1950s and met Luis's mother a few years later. She was born in Colorado of immigrant Mexican parents. Luis's father had retired after many years of working in his own construction company. Luis's mother had retired after teaching secondary school for most of the years after her 3 children were born. Both parents were alive and well in Colorado. When I first saw him in 2013, Luis had a law office in Oakland and told me that he buried himself in his work, but he continued to live across the bay in San Francisco. He had never been ill and described himself as being in good health, considering the usual things for someone my age. His partner of 11 years, Carrie, had died from pancreatic cancer 6 years prior to our first meeting. Carrie had been HIV negative. Initially, Luis wanted to talk about his social isolation, and after a short while, he did. I first came in because of something that happened about a month before I met you, and I want to talk about it now. I was at a friend's party, a very rare thing in my life, and I met a guy about my age, and there was something that really clicked. He was, well, you could look at his face and know that you had something in common, that he was a person with whom you'd have some kind of mutual understanding. I could tell that almost before he started talking. And what were you perceiving? I asked. I don't know exactly. He was very direct, honest looking. He seemed solid. I wanted to say that he looked like he'd been around the block, the epidemic block, and made it home. I feel like it was the same block I've been around, and that we'd seen the same things. It was a feeling, and he had a little bit of sadness on his face that I recognized, or maybe it was seriousness. He seemed alone, too, like me. Whatever it was exactly, it told me that we would understand each other. So, did you talk? We talked for a couple of hours. Not a word about the epidemic, but that's not what I was after. We talked about a lot of other things. Did you find that your first perceptions of him were true? What's his name? Mark. They were completely true. It was one of those odd things, like I'd known him all my life, and that we were getting back together after a little hiatus. I have a couple of really close friends from school in New York and Boston who are like that. You don't see them for a year, and after talking for 1 minute, you feel like you last saw them a half hour ago. I don't have friends like that here anymore. They're all gone. With Mark, I kept thinking, I must have met this guy before, but I don't think I had. But you started to say something. I don't remember what I was going to say. Well, you were saying how familiar he felt, how good the connection was, but I sensed that there was something bothering you about Mark. Oh, no, it wasn't about Mark. It was that I never followed up. We exchanged numbers, and I've never called him. Luis was silent, staring across the room at the bookshelves. Why? Why what? Oh, because I can't imagine why he'd be interested in me, just as a friend. Forget anything else. I'm not interested in sex with him anyway. I've been pretty lonely since Carrie died, and I'm just after a friend I can talk to. You still haven't said why you couldn't be friends. One is being Latino, which guys are into or not, though that's more a sexual thing, which wasn't going on here. The other is that I'm pretty sure he's negative, so my being positive alone, I mean with no idea of sex, is something that a lot of people avoid. I mean, look at me. Luis pointed to his collapsed cheeks, which showed a substantial loss of normal subcutaneous fat, an HIV-related condition known as lipodystrophy. I look awful. I know a lot of positive and negative men who are friends these days, older men especially. I don't know Mark, but I could imagine his being accepting of you as a friend, and maybe sexually. Did you have the sense that he had a sexual interest in you? Luis looked puzzled. No, I didn't get a sexual vibe from him. But why are you asking that? Because some negative men will avoid positive men sexually, and some won't. And some positive men will avoid negative men. I doubt this is all news to you. I was wondering if you're avoiding his possible sexual interest in you. No, of course I know that. Even Carrie and I had a problem with it. I think it's just the whole idea of a positive man. He's contaminated, radioactive. Sex or no sex, for another guy my age, I think he just takes one look at me and the whole epidemic comes rushing back. That all seems possible, but why don't you actually ask Mark? Why don't you try calling him and get together and talk about it? Does that feel like it would offer too much of a possibility of rejection? Yes, actually it does. Luis seemed to think for a few minutes. I've been through a lot of that, 25 years to be exact, and I guess I just don't want to risk it anymore. But right now, as we're sitting here talking, you're feeling all the rejection and I don't want more. I do understand that, but you're cutting off the possibility of having a different experience. Without calling Mark, we know the outcome. You're going to sit with the rejection that you already feel anyway. If you call him, you might not have to. I certainly don't know, but I don't think you do either. He hasn't called me. I know that, but I don't know why he hasn't. It is possible that he thinks you're not interested in him, and that's why he hasn't called. Maybe you two are in a standoff. Luis and I sat together silently for another 10 minutes, until the end of the hour. As he walked toward the door, he turned to me. I'm going to call him. If he tells me to fuck off, I'm going to blame you. Luis laughed, and just before he closed the door, he put his head back in and said, "Thank you." During our appointment the following week, Luis gave me a report. He had called Mark, and they had had dinner on Saturday. When Luis called, Mark said that he thought Luis might not be interested in him because Mark was HIV negative. Mark's speculation about why Luis might avoid a negative man was not empty. Sometimes positive men do avoid negative men, and one important reason is that positive men can be uncomfortable having to disclose their HIV status, particularly when the relationship is potentially sexual, and risk rejection. Other reasons are that a positive man may be more self-conscious about having HIV and about the visible consequences of HIV. With men who are not positive, or the positive man may fear that negative men will be judgmental or blaming about the positive man's HIV status. Positive men often anticipate being more readily accepted and better understood by other positive men, and this is sometimes true. Some negative men, particularly those who have been involved with positive men, are perceptive and sensitive about such feelings as Mark was. During their dinner, Luis had found out a great deal about Mark. He was 61 and had had two partners die of AIDS, one in 1984, the other a decade later. He told Luis that during the early years of the epidemic, he had thought that he was himself positive. Mark had been alone for the past 8 years and, like Luis, was grateful to have a friend to talk to. Their conversation left Luis feeling even more strongly that the two had much in common, both historically and currently. Both men had had partners die, and both had lost numerous friends to HIV. Both had little remaining social support, other than families who lived at a considerable distance. Mark's in New Orleans. And both men, one positive, the other negative, had survived the early epidemic. Luis had told Mark of his apprehension about their different HIV statuses, and Mark had responded, "Now, we're on the same side of that fence, the one that used to divide us. I had that with both my partners. You and I, we've both survived." Luis spoke to me about his experience of what Mark had said. What used to separate us, our HIV statuses, seems to have disappeared, at least in some ways. The fact is, we are both still alive, which Mark had not expected either, and we're both wondering how we got here. It wasn't until our dinner that I was aware of how baffled I am about being alive. I don't think I completely accept it after all these years, and it's such a relief to be able to talk to someone who understands that. I want to learn to use that. Use what? I asked. Just being alive. Even if I'm bewildered about it, it's true, and at my age it's going to be over one way or another. In the meantime, I want to use it. Mark and I talked a lot about that. It's as if we've both been sitting around wondering if it's true, and it is. We're here. I told Mark that my 59th birthday was coming up, which puts me right on the cusp of 60. And I was wondering whether to cry or have a party, and he completely understood what I meant. He said, "Have a party! I hope you'll invite me." And being HIV negative, how is it that Mark is so surprised by being alive? How is it that you share this feeling of surprise? I don't know exactly. He thought for 4 years that he was positive, but that's a long time ago. Yes, I do know. He had his two partners die. He had all these other people too. You're connected to people you're close to, and you expect to be like them. You want to be like them. I've had exactly the same experience he's had. I had all these people die, and I was left behind. Mark and I were both left behind, and HIV or not, we don't understand why you're still here. It's just baffling. Luis was suddenly silent. What? Luis teared up, but sat silently, then slowly began speaking. This is the first time I've thought this, but I'm wondering if I deserve it. Deserve what? Being alive. Being so lucky. You'd look at me and say, what's so lucky about this? Luis pointed to the lipodystrophy in his cheeks again. But it's lucky, like a miracle, and I should use it rather than sit around and wonder about it. I think Mark and I both realized that all in one dinner. I guess that's one of the better dinners you've ever had. The best. The very best. Except for the night I met Carrie. Luis's relationship with Mark continued and had, after 4 or 5 months, also become sexual. It's not hot sex, but it's good, and I appreciate it, Luis told me. The two had made friends with another couple of similar age and life experience. One member of the new couple was HIV positive, the other negative, and they had been together for 26 years. Luis and Mark had created a new, small community of friends, rooted but not living in a common history. As my discussions with Luis continued, we realized that he and Mark had both partly avoided new friends because the two could not readily relate to those who had not shared their historical experience. And those who did share it often feared that talking about it would only be re-traumatizing. They would simply remind one another of things they wanted to forget. Both Luis and Mark had independently been afraid of becoming permanently mired in an outgoing, debilitating, depressive reliving of the epidemic. Instead, they found a balance in a present-day life that was also informed by a common history shared with others with whom they mutually bore witness. Luis and Mark recognized that they would not get over their historical experience, but they could construct new lives that accounted for it without being consumed by it. They were not living in their histories, but they were acknowledging them and recognizing that they were a significant part of the bond the two felt for each other. This understanding, and the new social support it allowed, was a valuable change in Luis's life. He was living with more resilience and less protective rigidity, and he experienced this change in a vitality that he had not felt since before Carrie's death. Luis worked less, too.